Okay, I want to welcome all of you to the 8th episode of Stefan Frank's Photobook Show. So we have done 8 already, Stefan. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, today's subject is the world is not flat. And most of you know that I'm Anja from StrudelmediaLive. And for those of you who don't know Stefan yet, he is based in Heidelberg, Germany. He has taught quite a few classes for StrudelmediaLive, and he has 2 classes coming up. If you want to ask questions while Stefan is making his presentation, you can just unmute yourself and ask, or you can put the question into the chat. Either way is completely fine. You can definitely speak up directly if you like. The talk will be about an hour long. And I think that's about it. And I want to thank Stefan for yet another episode of his Photobook Show. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me, Anja.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for showing up for tonight's show. The world is not flat, which comes probably as kind of a surprise. Let me start by, because we have a lot of books to look at, let me start by sharing my screen with you and starting with some introductory notes on this. Flatness. Let me start with this. Sorry, Anja, I have to move you a little bit to the side here. Let me start with this. This is when you think about photography. When I try to prepare for this photobook show, where I have grouped together some pictures on a very weird concept of flatness, I thought about what actually is photography. And I came up with this very simple scheme of what photography actually is. So it is obviously very simple. We all know how to do that. We all know what a photograph is. So we start by with the world, with something that is beautiful or newsworthy, an event, and we want to photograph it. So we place ourselves with our little tiny black box in front of it and snap a picture of it. We try to make it properly exposed, well composed, and try to depict what we actually see in front of us. Then we take this photograph and put it into our digital or analog darkroom or lightroom, process it, and eventually make a print out of it. So we have some kind of instantiation of it. We make a digital or chemical print. We see our pictures in the newspaper, maybe. We see it, we put it on Instagram. So all these kinds of different instantiations where we have to make a lot of decisions about how big is it, how will it be presented, how does it look on the wall in a museum, the dimensions of it, which paper do we print of it. So a lot of decisions go into that. So this is the idea of what is actually a photograph is something that is actually not that simple to answer if you look at it this way. So quite naturally, the process of how the world becomes an image is a little bit convoluted. So it's a little bit difficult to do that, actually. And most photographers' interests are more or less even distributed on this scale. So you depict something that you think is photograph worthy. You put some effort into making a proper photograph of it. You put some effort into preparing the negative, and you put some effort into making sure it looks good on the wall. And you can argue that when all of these things come together, the world, how you prepare it, the photograph, then you come up with a great picture like this one from Thomas Höpker. He actually managed to do that. So the piece of the world, in this case Muhammad Ali, and the fist of Muhammad Ali, is obviously newsworthy and obviously interesting. But he also put a lot of work into how to develop this into an actual photograph. You see the print marks, the darkroom marks by Pablo Inirio, who was a very famous darkroom specialist who did a whole lot of work for Magnum photographers to make their photographs, to make their negatives really shine on papers. So his interest is very evenly distributed on this scale. But it's interesting to look that some photographers have different emphasis on where they locate their work on this scale of world and image. And let me pick some examples for you. So obviously, Robert Capa was oriented towards the world. So that he became famous was a direct cause of being in the Spanish Civil War and being present on D-Day. So he was mainly a news photographer. He was very much oriented towards the world. Cartier-Bresson, with his decisive moment, he literally put it into his theory that it is important that the decisive moment happened in the world and not in the darkroom. So how he was interested is where his interest lie was pretty much in his theory of how he understood photography. William Eggleston is an interesting case because he often depicted things that are very mundane, very simple, and one would even say maybe not that photographically interesting. But he also put an emphasis on how he printed it. So his way of using a very high glossy way of printing color pictures was an integral part of his work, and this was the basis why he became famous. And it's interesting to compare this with the career of Gordon Parks, who was photographing at pretty much the same time, at pretty much the same place in the pretty much similar places in the South. And he also did a lot of color photography, but he was decisively much poorer than William Eggleston. So he didn't have any access to this kind of printing material. So as a result of that, he never, his color photography career never really took off until late in the 2010, 2020, when his color photography was rediscovered and was printed in a different way. So everybody is a little bit by chance, by personal interest, by way of his career, they locate themselves somewhere more to the world, more to the image. This scale has nothing to do with how artsy you are or how good your pictures are. You even find things like the IKEA picture frame. So the pictures that you find in there, they are definitely about the image, and they are only their sole purpose is to look good in a frame that IKEA sells. So that has nothing to do with the word. It's just for selling frames. So it's a different way of emphasis on the picture. Painting obviously has a different idea of the images because it has a different tie to the world. And I will want to mention one photographer, Dirk Breckmann here, who has some kind of a different emphasis on photography. So for him, photography, he has a definite idea of what a photograph is. For him, a photograph is only the thing that he prints himself on a silver gelatine print and hangs it on the wall. This is all his photograph. So he's not concerned with what he actually photographs. So for him, the world is more or less only material. And he is famous for having his darkroom fitted with a special ventilation system to allow him to spend 8 or more hours a day in his darkroom without choking. So he works exclusively in the darkroom, and this is the place where his pictures actually come to life. So he's very hesitant about making books. He's very hesitant about making books on Instagram, because because he would argue these are not his photographs. His photographs are just the things that he produces. So for him, he has a definite answer. For everybody else, it's a little bit more complicated. What actually is a photograph when it is not the event that you photograph? It is not the negative, it's not the print, it's not the image on Instagram, it's not the picture on the wall. So what is it? So it's somewhere in between the image and the world, somewhere in there is photography. Bregman has a decisive answer to that. He says a photograph is actually a physical object. So something that has a defined dimension, something that you can touch and hold. In the case of Bregman, not hold in your hands, because he's making very large prints, but it is an actual physical object for him. And at that, always a flat physical object. So one decisive feature of these, that all these images have in common, they are flat. And this is a decisive difference to the world that they depict. So the world that surrounds it is definitely not flat. So somewhere along this way, where the world is here and the image is there, somewhere along the way, something weird is happening. And it's interesting that you can see that you can even ask ChatGPT what is happening here. What happens on the way when I project a three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional plane, which is basically what photography is. And of course, with these kinds of questions, the interesting thing about ChatGPT has on everything an answer. It may not be useful or right, but it always has an answer. But ChatGPT actually has some good points here. So ChatGPT says we inevitably lose some information. So something gets lost on the way. And this projection might distort the size and shapes of what you see right before you. And it also says it cannot fully capture the richness and complexity of the word. So while this is not immediately useful, ChatGPT makes a good point. But then ChatGPT, please explain when their photography is all about loss of complexity, loss of richness, distortion, loss of information. Why the heck do we still enjoy photography so much? And let me try a very weird indirect answer to this. So this is Edouard Manet, Olympia from 1863. This is where some critics, arguably, for example, the New York critic Clement Greenberg, this is where he exactly poses the birth of modernism, the birth of the period of painting that was eminent in the first part of that dominated the 20th century. And he's placing the birth of modernism almost exactly on the point in 1863 when Manet painted this picture. This picture created a lot of scandal for a lot of reasons. One reason was certainly that he depicted a courtesan, so what we would probably today call a sex worker, a person who is offering her body for money. So this was at that time a topic that was unworthy of painting, but that was not all that was brought up by his why this picture caused such a scandal and was banned from this salon where he was showed at the first time. The critics also complained that he is an amateurish way of that he has an amateurish way of painting. So everything in his picture is flat. So there is a loss of three-dimensionality. He is not depicting the shapes in a way that we can see the actual three-dimensional forms of this. So his painting here seen in a very flat way on Google Arts. This was actually called an amateurish painting. And Clement Greenberg placed this picture at the birth of modernism, and he was very outspoken about why he did this. He is quoting here flatness 4 times in this very short paragraph. So for him, the idea behind this picture and what this picture started was that it realized that the painting is actually flat. It is not only a depiction of a 3-dimensional space, but it's actually a flat surface. And Manet was the first one who became aware of this, that this that is not, and this was a point where painting lost its connection to the world, or at least the connection to the world was becoming different. It was becoming more aware of its own materiality. So he is arguing here, instead of asking the question that we usually ask when we encounter a picture, what does the painting depict? What do we see in the image? A more useful way of approaching an image is look at the painting itself and look at how it forms shapes and how it respects its own flatness. And he was an advocate of the abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock. This is number 31 from 1950, where he is always talking about that the picture is an actual physical object. And the restaurators actually experienced that this is an actual physical object when they started restoring it in somewhere in 2015, and they examined the picture more closely because it was becoming to fall apart because there's so much paint on this image that it started breaking the frame. And they examined it, they started examining it, and they found this little speck of wood inside here. And they also found a fly that somehow had ended up in this picture. So this is, the restaurators are very much aware that a picture is actually a physical object. So when we look at flatness in photography, we will be looking at exactly this. How do we deal with this loss of information? How does photography deal with this loss of information? How do we deal with this distortion of size and shapes? We'll look at some strategies of photographic strategies to achieve flatness and to get away from this and to untie our connections to the world. And we will look at this weird tension between the richness and complexity of the world and the loss of it in a photograph. And maybe we will find some answers to why we are enjoying this, looking at photographs so much, although they are such objects that have so many faults in them. So, and with that, let's look at some books. Let me stop sharing here. So this is an exception, because I will talk about a book that I do not actually own. Let's start with Christopher Woolf. He is predominantly a painter and a sculptor. And I found this his photographs. He's also a photographer, and I found his photographs in this catalog from Gagosian. They were making an exhibition with his work. And he's also doing his these kinds of photographs. I do not own them because they're quite expensive and hard to come by. So I basically only own this one publication here with his photographs here, but I just want to include them because he was the one person that started all these ideas of flatness. So he's born in Chicago. He's currently living in Marfa, Texas, which is a plain which looks like this, obviously. A lot of desert, a lot of wide open spaces. And he's making these kinds of sculptures here. And these sculptures are inspired by the wire that is lying around there that comes from these wire fences that you see here in the background. And you see them, you encounter them when you wander through the desert in Texas somewhere, that you encounter these threads of wire there. And this has inspired him to these kinds of sculptures. And the interesting thing to notice about this is that he comes from these kinds of paintings. And if you combine these kinds of sculptures and these kinds of paintings, they start to unlock each other. So the paintings, let me close up on this a little bit. These paintings are always about a certain layering of images. So he starts with an already tainted canvas, and then he starts painting on this canvas, and then he lets it dry, and then he starts over painting it again. So all of this is about shapes emerging and shapes vanishing. And he started out with this black and white, then he introduced some color, and then he eventually moved on to sculpture like this here. And the sculpture have similar approaches. So they are, the idea behind them is that when you move around them, you get different layers, so different shapes that emerge and vanish again, openings that open up and close down again, things that are behind this that appear and vanish again. So he applies a similar approach to layering to his sculptures. And he photographed all his life, and these photographs became an integral part of his work. And I just want to show you his approach to landscape photography and his strategies of doing landscape photography. This is why I always come back to this publication here, because I find this, I overlooked that at the first time when I saw this. There are a couple of things to observe here. So one is he has a different approach to landscape photography than, say, photographers like Ansel Adams with his approach to the zone system, where he tried to fill up all the grays, and he was very clear about not losing information and depicting the three-dimensionality of the landscape in the most accurate way that he could achieve. And one strategy that Ansel Adams has, he went there at dusk or at dawn, because these are the two times of the day when you have when landscapes appear to be most three-dimensional. And Christopher Wool goes to the opposite side of it. So he tries to remove every kind of three-dimensionality out of the picture. So he goes deliberately in the midst of the day. So when the shadows are as short as they get. So, and there is something curious happening when you do that. So this, what happened then is that everything becomes flat, and you do not see that this road is actually leading into the background of the picture, but there's so much loss of information that you only have shapes that appear next to each other and that form each other. And for this effect, the time of day is crucial for this kind of approach. And in contrast to his very abstract images, what happens in his photography, that the photograph starts to flip. So when you know that he is after only shapes, you're always oscillating between, I can read this, I can read that this is actually a street that goes into the background, so I can read this as a three-dimensional scene, but I can also read this as a two-dimensional object that is just one shape, a third shape, and a fourth shape. And he's using all kinds of mechanisms to work with this, like these reflections here. These reflections deliberately work against the three-dimensionality of the picture. And even more true the further you go away. So the further you go away, the more you see them as Christopher Wool sees them, just as shapes, just as flat shapes. And he used these kinds of strategies in his other pictures. He is not interested in what you actually see, what the actual word content of the image is. Here, he's using multiple exposures, and here he's actually not interested in what you see in the image, these kinds of whatever it may be, but he's only interested in the shapes that this forms. And this double exposure here, like in this image, is only used to shape, to form more shapes and to create more tension between these shapes. And if you look at this picture here on the bottom, this is actually a boat, which when you examine it closely, you see that it's a boat, but it's not important. He does not use it as a boat. He just uses the shape of a boat. He's eventually becoming, and some of his work, he's becoming much more simple, where he's just interested in these natural kind of sculpture that emerges in his backyard when he walks around and sees these structures that are formed out of actual lines and shadow lines, and this comes together on the pictorial plane. So this is an interesting case of a sculptor, a painter who knows both these ways of how three-dimensionality works and how two-dimensionality works, and his work is always oscillating between the two-dimension and the second dimension and the third dimension. So, but then let's talk about failure. This is one of my most favorite books. I have to admit that. So I'm very happy that I always have the opportunity here to talk about the things that I really love. And I really love Charlotte Posenenske. She is by trade, she's a sculptor. So she's been working in the 60s. She's working with industrial forms. So she's combining these industrial forms into sculpture. And in 1968, she wrote a manifesto that explained how she works. And let me just read this first part of the manifesto to you. So this is what she does. The things I make are variable, as simple as possible, reproducible. They are components of a space. Since they are like building elements, they can always be rearranged into new combinations or positions. Thus, they alter the space. I leave this alteration to the consumer, who thereby again and anew participates in the creation. This still goes on, but the point, I think, is pretty clear what she does. So what she does is she's forming these kinds of objects out of material, out of industrial material, prefabricated things. And she's forming them into sculptures, and she places these sculptures into spaces. And a lot of her work is like this, like an intervention into a public space where she puts her the structures into the space. But for her, this artwork is not finished when she does that. So all of her artwork is about participation. It is about surrounding the artwork and looking at it. She sometimes even puts wheels under their sculptures, and she allows the participants to just move the things freely around and just to experience what happens when I move this thing here and I move this thing there. How does it change my perception of the space surrounding it? And a lot of her work was about these kinds of happenings where people came in here with these structures and built these kind of structures here. And I always love this picture where a guy is just bringing this into the space. And this is by far my most favorite picture of this, where people are just coming into here, and there is a woman with a bullhorn who is commanding them and telling them where to put the things. So all of her work is about participation. It is about the artwork being a social structure, and the artist is not this dictator who says, okay, this is my artwork and this, I give it to you and you just have to spectate it. She understands herself as just a facilitator of these kinds of dialogues. And here we actually experience loss of photography, because all of this is gone when you just have a picture of these happenings. So all of this interaction is gone. So we are pretty much relegated to just watching one possible instantiation of her artwork. And she was so fed up with the arts establishment surrounding this art in the 60s that she quit right after making this manifesto and making this tube series. She quit art altogether and went into social work, and spent most of her life as a social worker and not as an artist. So I'm kind of conflicted about this really wonderful book, because it's all we have from her. She died very early in 1985. So all of her artwork just came out only after her death, because she prevented everybody from showing this work. So this is all we have, and still feels like something of a betrayal, because it relegates us to the position of a spectator and to a pure consumer of this prefabricated artwork. Still a great book to have. So today, I don't know why it comes from. Probably comes from this idea of flatness. But today we have the pictures with weird stories behind them. So this is Steve Kahn, The Hollywood Suites. This is a picture. This is a book I should not have because it went out of print, and I did not know anything about Steve Kahn, and I only snatched up the last instantiations of this to a lower price in an antiquariat in Munich. So, and I probably wouldn't have bought it if it was not so cheap. I'm so happy that I bought it, because it has such a marvelous story to it. So Steve Kahn was born in Chicago, moved to Hollywood, and he was a news photographer and a street photographer, but he was also immersed in this ongoing art scene of the 70s in Los Angeles with Ed Ruscha and Richard Prince. So he knew all their work, but he was basically a news photographer. So, and in the 70s, and 73 to 75, there was this great recession. So he lost his job, and he was hard pressed to make any kind of money here. So what he did, he decided with a few of his friends to make a fetish magazine, because fetish and porn in that area was obviously the only thing where he thought, okay, I could make, as a photographer, can make some money out of this. So, and what he did was he invited SM models into rundown and deserted motel somewhere outside of Los Angeles, and he started photographing them. And his idea was just to make this magazine to make some bucks out of it. And that he started out with that, and he very soon realized, okay, I'm not cut out for that, so I'm not interested. Actually, I'm not interested in porn, and I'm not really good at that. But he did it anyway. So he made this. He started out with making these very straightforward portraits of actresses that worked in this line of that were actual professional SM actresses that were know something about bondage. So he hired these models. He also hired a magician to make these kinds of knots that were easily to resolve. And he started photographing them. So his interest very soon was first to make money, which failed miserably because he only sold a couple of these magazines because the pictures were not really erotic. And it ended up with the printer running away with the money to Mexico. So he started out with making these very straightforward portraits. And he eventually, the fascinating thing about this book is that he explains in pictures his way of thinking. So eventually he ended up with this shot, and the way he shot these models was always with a flash, slightly overexposed, with a 35mm camera that is prone to reduce by its very technical nature a lot of information from the image. And he ended up with this very flattened out shots. And he ended up with this shot where he obviously realized, okay, there is something that interests me more than when I'm actually looking at. I'm more interested in the form and how it occupies these rooms. So he went on to photographing these models in weird positions inside these rooms, inside these deserted rooms. And I tend to think he eventually ended up at this picture here, where he blocked out the thing that he was actually trying to photograph. He blocked it out with shape. And here a weird thing happened. So there were suddenly, by this blocking out of the thing that you actually want to happen, that you actually want to photograph, you start talking about shapes and start talking about the pictorial plane itself. So he then went on to concentrate on the rooms where he photographed them. So this was a deserted motel. There were some leftovers there. And again, he's always using the same approach, the 35mm, the direct flash that flattens out the image. And he came up with this very minimalist pictures that talk about some weird way of inhabiting this space and how it is set up. He then went on to photograph the windows and brought in the outer world, which makes this enclosure of this deserted room and the thing that happened in these deserted rooms even more poignant. So again, he drives us to the point where we lose all kinds of architectural information about this. He then went on to the doors, and the doors always had these tiny little images in here. He's very methodical about how he progresses in here. And he arrives at these minimalistic pictures that have this, well, you cannot, do not know if you can read it here, where he suddenly binds his very abstract, this very minimalistic pages, pictures back to what he's actually talking about. He's talking about love and how we try to approach it, how we try to attain it. And then he comes on the idea that bondage is one way of constraining movement of bodies. So he applied this to other movements. So the movement of people through a door, and he actually used this bondage to close down the doors. And then he went on to photographing the mirrors. So there were all the mirrors in this hotel were smashed. So he started photographing these deserted mirrors. And then he introduced the other part of the situation, not only the models that are in there, but also the photographer, the person that is looking at these models. And here he starts talking about identity and how it fails to represent him, how the mirrors are all empty. He went on to more conceptual ways to use his image. So he devised these multi-part photographs where he just took a lot of, took 3 or more images of the rooms that he was in and assembled them. But these are pictures with a twist here. So this is, again, always a very flat image, but it has a twist. So this is an image of a ceiling, but it is depicted as if we are looking down on it. It looks like a floor. And if you examine it closer, it looks like this combines to a whole room. So it is actually an assembled picture of the ceiling, but we don't know that. So probably it's just the 4 corners of the ceiling, and there is space missing in between. So this is the reason, together with the reduction in the image, this is the reason why this picture feels totally claustrophobic.
So, Stefan,
Yeah,
we
sure.
have a question, and that is, did the photographer set out to click interesting 2D pictures here, or is it that he came across them gradually or accidentally, or I guess through the process of working on them?
I think it's a mixture of both. So the text talks about that it's just a technical thing. So he set out just with a cheap camera because he couldn't afford more. He set out with a flash because the home motel was pretty dim. It was pretty dark in there. And he didn't have a proper way to measure the light completely, and he only had this tiny flash on top of his image. So he just started out with, hey, I do that just to make sure I get something on my pictures. And then he started working through his negatives, and if you examine this, it becomes less and less detailed. So he starts out with this portraits which are somewhat detailed, which are somewhat properly exposed, and it becomes more and more reduced. So this is a process that he started. So to answer this, I think it's a question. It's a mixture of both. And let me just end on this one here. This is an interesting shot because it also starts talking about the truth values of pictures. So he assembled this kind of pictures and suggests, okay, this is a wall that we're looking at. This is a corner of a room that we're looking at. But if you examine it closely, he changes the scale in between. So this is a further apart. So the top and bottom pictures are further apart than the one in the middle. So this suggests some kind of continuity, but there is no continuity. So there is something missing here. And this is something that you probably would have missed if he did not reduce all of it out of the picture. So there's not much information here, but the information that he's showing, everything is speaking volumes here. So, and this is a wonderful example for how this very abstract, how this book oscillates between abstraction and binds this abstraction back to the story with which it started. So I have no idea if you can still get this book because I snatched up some of the last prints here, but it's an excellent book to have. So, and this were all people that came from the 3D world and reduced it onto a very two-dimensional view of this world. So let me come to this. This is complete papers by Thomas Demand. And Thomas Demand he's practically the opposite approach. So this is a very very beautiful catalog to one of his large retrospective exhibition that he did. Thomas Demand comes from the opposite spectrum. So let me try to explain what he does. He's basically doing this. So he's starting with paper, which is a definitely two-dimensional, almost two-dimensional object. And he's folding it into three-dimensional space. And then he's forming sculptures out of that, and then he's photographing these sculptures again. He originally started in Düsseldorf to study art and sculpture, among others, with Gerhard Richter. Before Gerhard Richter kicked him out and sent him to the Bechers, which were just a room further. And there he started continued his work on sculpture. He originally thought he is a sculptor with doing these kinds of sculptures done from paper. But he very soon realized that he's not interested in the actual sculptures, but he's only interested in the pictures he takes to document his work, his sculptures. So what he did is he usually makes these sculptures, he takes a photo and then he destroys the sculptures again. So the sculptures are something that you only see, that only exist anymore in these images. And you could think that this is just a gimmick. So that sounds like a very gimmicky way to approach sculpture and photography. But if you look at this whole book, he achieves with this indirection. So he's 3 times removed from the world. So he's taking a picture of the world. He's modeling his sculpture after this picture. He's taking a photograph of this sculpture, and then he's hanging this sculpture again as a picture on the wall. So he's 3 times removed from the world. When you browse through this, his whole book, this becomes apparent that this is a very versatile way to talk about a lot of image, a lot of things in the world. For example, this is a sculpture that he did after a picture that was taken after the wall came down and the Stasi in Germany, the Staatssicherheit, so the GDR state police, they abandoned their offices and left a whole mess while trying to destroy all the evidences of what happened in the GDR after the wall came down. So this is actually a press photo, and he carefully reconstructed this press photo. So when you look at the press photo to it, you will see that every paper that you see on the bottom here, it is at exactly the right place, and the lamp is at the right place. So everything is set up in a way to mimic the actual photographic paper, the actual photograph that started his journey. So in this way, doing it in this way, he talks about an important moment in German history, but he also talks about the circulation of images. So what life these images form, how we interact with them. And he displays his images in a almost lifelike size in a museum. So just to quote this, some details about the production of this image of this book. He always had it always has these inlays here. This paper that talk about Thomas Demann's way of doing his photographs, but they also have the same size as this inlet here. So there's a lot of detail work that went into this book. So it's a really beautiful book. And just to show you some of the breadth, so the width of that he can talk about with this way of photographing. This is Photobooks. You can always see that because it has a number of the year when he produced it. This is from 2009. So here is talking about photography and the role that photography plays. But this is from Parliament. This is actually a shot from a press photo of the German Bundestag. So he's also talking about democracy, which is something that fascinates him most. And he's doing these kinds of things where he's playing with our ideas of how our memory works. So everybody who lives in Germany knows this picture, knows how this picture works, because we know these kinds of bus stops, how these bus stops looks, how abandoned they are. And taking away all the grit and dirt and the realness of the actual picture actually makes this memory more poignant for everybody who lives in Germany. So this is from Control Room. This is from 2011. This is a control room of Chernobyl. So this is actually a film still from a video that was taken from the control room in Chernobyl, and it was titled in the press Control Room, but it also is evidently talking about loss of control. So you see these tiles that are hanging from the ceiling here, and by reducing all that and removing all this grittiness of the actual picture and making it big and hanging it on a wall, this allows us to experience this by being very removed from this actual historic moment. We actually seem to be much, much closer and have some kind of reflective grasp on this moment of history that happened. So, Thomas Demand, I have no idea if you need more than this. So there are a couple of pictures. So Mac always throws out a new book by Thomas Demand once a year because it's continuing to do work. I'm not sure that you need more than this because, as I said, he has a wide breadth of topics that he's talking about, but you know a lot about him when you know this book.
Say, Stefan, there was a question about the earlier book by Steve Kahn about what the meaning of the lines on the left side in the book are, and I'm guessing that she's talking about the chapter pages.
This here. Actually, I think this is a very dubious decision by the designer here.
I'm almost thinking the question is about, there you go, on the left page, like what those lines are for. I mean, I'm not quite sure if that's what the question is about, but
if you look at this, these lines pick up these lines here. So
okay.
he picks, they pick up the abstraction that Kahn has inside his pictures. This is picked up in this kind of frames and this kind of lines that you see here. You can see this is actually one wall, and this is an adjacent wall to it. So you find this back here. So it's picked up. I'm not sure if I really would have needed that. I find this even more dubious because it's harder to see here. That also reflects is also reflected here. But you see here these lines and here these lines. I'm not so sure what I like about that, if I really like that.
Stefan, I think you only have one more book, right? Is that correct?
It's the last book, and I will briefly.
Okay. No, it's okay. I just want to make sure that there aren't any more. Okay, good.
Let me quickly browse through this one. This is another book that I hold very dear. So I realize that I tend to contradict myself. So last time I mentioned that Steidl is only doing boring books, and here I am showing the next exciting book by Steidl. So this is Dawid, Björn Davidsson. This is a Swedish photographer, born in 1949. And this is a book done by so he went back to Steidl for one last hooray. So he was originally coming from Steidl. So this is where he learned his trade of bookmaking. So he worked there before he founded MacBooks. And then do not get there is not much about this history of Steidl and Mack in here, but I think that Steidl still has the rights to the work of Dawid, but Michael Mack wanted to do this book with him. So let me start with this, because Dawid is a photographer for which it is very important. He is very similar to Dirk Bachmann, that he realizes his images only when he does the prints. So only when the prints are done, then his work is done. So it's not in the negative, it's not in the photograph, but it's only when the print is done. So this is the reason why all images here are produced from the photographic prints, unless otherwise stated in the caption. So this is not from the negatives and not from the digitized negatives. It's all from the scanned prints, which I think is important to know. Dawid is a weird photographer. I have to. He's really. I love him because of his weirdness. He is not working in projects like we understand it, but he's working in series, and the series are usually held together by some kind of common photographic approach. For example, this is his Rust series. I do not know if this is a little bit too tiny to be actually able to read this. This is his Rust series. He's doing this for 20, 30 years. He just starts with this and just continues with it. So they all share a similar pictorial approach, which you see when you see his Skåne series. It's a Sweden series, which is a completely different approach to photography and about for printmaking. They share they have some similarities, but they are totally different when you look at this. This is the M&M series. This is a series of tools, and this is a P shadow suite, which comes from, the P comes from pedestal. So it's actually a sculptural pedestal that he used to make his photograph, and he places a shadow of the pedestal prominently in here. And this is how the book ends. And this is important to know, that this is how Dawid perceives his photography. He perceives it as a series, an ongoing, series. And Michael Mack, who has been friends with Dawid for, how I understood it, for a very long time, so he knows everything. He knows his whole work, and he did something fabulous. He looked at all this, all the images of Dawid, and he made one continuous edit out of it. And you see this, probably he made a really, really long edit out of all of this. And this is really hard to do and really weird to do. And he had a very different approach than Dawid had to his photography, because he's looking at all his work and he's looking for visual similarities, connections between pictures, like certain kind of roundness. Then he moves from here to here. Then he moves from here to a portrait, and you see, yeah, when you flip back, you see the similarity in the shape of the head. And then you connect this look on his face to a weird scene from childhood. And then you connect this weird childhood scene to something that looks like a motherly figure, but also to a religious figure. Then he connects this cross from Ash Wednesday to other crosses painted on bottles. Then he connects this crosses with the structures that you see in this picture, but he also connects it on a level, on a content level, where he talks about religion as a condition, as a human condition. So he places this figure in here. And then you have this figure that connects to an animal that you see here. And then he connects this animal to a person lying over him. And so on and so on. So he's when he's eventually arriving at, well, let me go through this again. So, and then he unearths connections here like this one, which you can, if you just see this picture in an isolated space, this is just a weird man with a bowler hat and a set of flowers. And you have no idea where he's going. But here, now you know where he's going. He's going to a funeral. And then suddenly all that is cute about this picture is gone in an instant. And if you connect it with this closed, shut down door, then the picture becomes another meaning. It becomes about the inevitability. And then he has this pauses in here. So this is really an excellent exercise in editing, where he takes all of this very abstract work of Dawid, connects it with his other works. Until he eventually arrives at this picture, which of course has a connection between this portrait and this skirt that you see here lying on this bed. And then he starts connecting it to the abstract work that Dawid does, where this comes has some kinds of resemblances in these shapes here. And then he continues with these shapes. And after this introduction, you start seeing not only shapes, but you start connecting these shapes again to faces, that there are faces emerging out of these shapes, just very similar to faces that we see in clouds. And then he connects it back to portraits. And then again, you see the portrait or the start of a portrait here.
So, Stefan, another question. Is the photographer or editor trying to convey something singular or particular here?
That's a difficult question. I'm asking this myself. I looked at so when you start looking, when you normally start looking at Dawid's pictures, they are some kind of opaque. So you look at an abstraction like this, you have no idea why he's doing that or what you're actually looking at. I think the edit opens up the visual world of Dawid. So he's opening up the weird connection that Dawid forms in his abstraction. So suddenly, when you see a connection like this here, like this gas mask and this button in here, they are connected. So I do not really know. I don't think that Michael Mackes really says, okay, this is what Dawid means, but he's just opening up venues into interpreting his work, how Dawid perceives the world and how he perceives shape, how he sees shapes and things. And let me end on this picture here, because this is something that I find striking, and that was something that unlocked Dawid for me. So he's editing it in this way. So he's starting with this figure here where you see it's an old woman. She's going slightly with her neck craned. And then he goes from here to here. And you see a similar shape here. You see a similar tension that you hear. But here, the tension is much more palpable because it's clearer and simpler than it is here. Suddenly, this is like a short circuit. That short circuit this totally abstract figure with a totally real picture, with a real condition. And this is actually the combination of pictures that I want to end with. Because when I look at this, I was thinking about this. This was something that when I thought about flatness that was something that went through my head. When we look at how Dawid approaches shapes, we can think about, is it things moving through the world, forming shapes? This is how Christopher Wool perceives it. Or is it how Dawid perceives it? Is it shapes moving through the world, forming things, forming people, and they just come together to form a woman that there are certain shapes that come together to form a woman that ascends from the train. So these are the things that went through my head when I looked at that, when I looked at Dawid. And this is an interesting, just to get back to ChatGPT, this is or something that you can also ask ChatGPT, this exact question, and ChatGPT actually gives you a proper answer to that, because it also has an opinion to everything in here. And this is all I have for you today. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Stefan. I will stop the spotlighting so that we can have a short conversation if anybody else wants to ask questions. Thank you so much, Stefan. Wow, the sequencing in the Dawid book was very fascinating. That was really nice to see how he decided to assemble these images and how they're all connected that way. And I always like Thomas Demann's approach of stripping all these spaces of details and then creating new spaces in the way that he wants them to be seen. Are there any more questions for Stefan?
Yeah, I have a question. The last image that we saw of Dawid's work was with the crane, the woman with the crane neck. Was the shape following that something that he constructed or a photograph of something?
This is from the Rust series. So the Rust series is,
okay.
So this is stuff picked up during walks.
Okay, I get it. All right, I see. Okay.
So there's Michael Mack is really the second author of this, because I think when Dawid did this, he did not make this connection. He does not make this connection. I see people walking like this, and I'm looking for shapes like that. He's just looking for interesting shapes. Okay. And if you see his books, if you see his work, is such an enormous archive of work. And to go through this and to come up with such an edit and come up with combinations like this is just the second participant in this artwork.
Okay.
Very nice, thank you.
Can I quickly ask, do you really think Dawid would have wanted that? Because the addition of putting these pieces of art together makes it, as you're saying yourself, a completely new piece of art. And I wonder if it doesn't take away from the actual value of the individual piece. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. I think so. Dawid participated in that. So he's actually opening up this whole. So he was in contact with him all the time. There is this longer piece. There's this longer essay by Michael Mack in the back of this, where he talks about how all of this comes together, how these abstractions come together. I think he would not. He doesn't want the artwork to be reduced. He doesn't want it to be reduced to this one interpretation. But I think that this is not what Michael Mack is doing. So he's doing just one. So even if you look at the artwork from Dawid, he's always arriving at a certain end point. But he's also explaining how he arrived there. But this pass to this endpoint. This does not explain the endpoint completely. So the endpoint is always, it's always something different. It's always something that is not reducible to this path. But it knowing something about his about the background actually sometimes makes it deeper. So I'll give you an example for that. So this is the M&M series, and the M&M series is these are tools from a toolbox that was gifted to him from a friend of his father, and he started photographing these toolbox. So the friend actually gave this toolbox to his father, and his father has been using this toolbox for quite a while, so he knew all these tools in here. So Dawid knows his father had touched all these tools, and he started photographing these tools after his father had died. So that was when he went through his things and he found this toolbox and he remembered, this is how he arrived at that. And this is where he started that. And this does not reduce the images, but it suddenly just opens up a different dimension to these kinds of images. And these very reduced images, maybe I can quickly find someone here. If you see an image like this is from the Toolbox series. You don't understand what it is. And you can perceive this in a way that you do not have to understand it. But if you understand it, it opens another dimension to this. And this is what I think this is, Michael Mack edit also does. It adds another dimension to it by connecting how the visual system of Dawid works, how he understands a plane, how he understands how to form, how he understands to dissect a plane, but also how he is connected to the things he actually photographs. And it just goes on. It's just...
Stefan, do you know already what your next talk will be?
No, not sure.
Okay, well, we'll work on that together. Let's have a conversation about that in a little bit.
I'm always open for suggestions. So if you have a book that you want me to look at, I'm always open for that. I'm always looking for new stuff.
Yeah, so everybody, if you do, send us your suggestions. Definitely, we're open for that. I know there are a few people who did not get the message that in the US, the time has changed already to daylight savings time. My apology, we did mention it in several emails and on the website, but not everybody saw it. Any other questions? We went over today, so I should wrap it up.
Yeah. Oh, okay. God, I'm carried away here.
All right. Stefan, wonderful. Thank you so much. Very inspiring. It's really nice to learn new things about also old books. Wonderful. Thank you everybody for being here, and see you in the next talk or in a class or wherever. Bye everybody.
Thank you.